This is our teaching video for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost, entitled Rested and Redirected. If you want to follow along in the Bible before you come on Sunday, our Old Testament reading is going to be from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 9b through 14. And I've told you before, whenever you see the B, it just means we're starting in the second half of the verse. And if you see an A, it means you stop at the first half of the verse. The second reading on Sunday is going to be from the book of Hebrews, continuing in the line that we've read. This is going to be Hebrews 12:18 through 29. And then finally the gospel story, a beautiful story of a healing that Jesus accomplishes on the worship day. That's going to be Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Well, one of the prominent features of the readings today, and it has to do with that word up here, rested, is the concept of Sabbath. And not even just the concept of Sabbath, but really also the command. Now, by how we number the Ten Commandments, and of course you'll notice there's more than one way to do that, honoring the Sabbath is actually the third commandment, by the way that Lutherans and Roman Catholics number them. And so it's remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So when we talk about Sabbath, we want to first talk about rest, because it's really a day of rest, but we also want to talk about it as remembrance. And not only remembrance, but with that remembrance comes the call to holiness. Now if you remember, of course, even the Ten Commandments themselves are redirecting us back to the creation, where God creates, at least in the first chapter of Genesis, for 6 days, and then on the seventh day God rests. And of course that seventh day of rest, which is where the word Sabbath comes from, is the Sabbath. Now one of the things that you can think about is that the Sabbath day, a day of rest, a day apart from work, was never understood to mean no work shall be done. That's actually kind of a modern concept for how we do work. And in fact, if you look at the story in which it appears from Genesis 1, God doesn't labor necessarily to create. God rather just speaks. But then there's this resting from a sort of creative work. So, one thing we have to say about the Sabbath is oftentimes we haven't thought too clearly about it or thought too deeply about it. Now, related to the Sabbath, you'll remember that human beings in that story are created on the sixth day. And what's significant about that is that God creates humans as a kind of prelude to the Sabbath. So human beings are kind of a prelude to the Sabbath in that God created us to share in His rest. This is really an important concept I want you to focus on. God created us to share in the divine rest, the rest of the divine. Now what exactly does that mean? Well, if you look at the command from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, where the third commandment is given, it's not just only a certain amount of you are going to rest. Rather, it's everybody. Everybody is called to rest. Everybody is called to pause. So we can just kind of pause, the famous pause symbol. Everyone is called to pause, and then that's where we get that second word, and remember. There's a sense in which human beings can be deformed, and by our deformity, by how our lives are shaped, we lose touch with our connection to God. We lose touch between the sixth day and the seventh day. And so the Sabbath is constantly redirecting us towards our true identity as people created in God's image to share in God's rest. And that's really God's prerogative to rest. So we don't want to say the Sabbath is just rest for the sake of resting, but the Sabbath is actually resting that we might be redirected and we might remember, yes, this is who we are. Now, one of the things that we need to account for when we talk about Sabbath is that there's a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or there's a difference between the experience of the Jews and the experience of the Christians. And one of the ways that we see this, and in fact this is going to help us kind of unpack the Hebrews reading, is the Jews celebrate the Sabbath from Friday sundown to Saturday at sundown. So really the Sabbath is sort of a rolling time, depending on when sundown is. And yet for the Christians, the Sabbath day is Sunday. And when you think about this idea of resting and remembering, you'll understand why. So for the Jews, they see this as the connection to Genesis, the seventh day. On the seventh day, they've rested. But really, according to the counting of the Bible, Sunday is actually not the seventh day, but it's the first day of the week. And that's how they mark time in the Bible. So you'll remember when Jesus is resurrected, it says on the first day of the week at early dawn, the women went to the tomb. So really, Christians moved Sunday for what I just quoted because Sunday is the day of resurrection. And that if in fact we are created to share in God's rest, well, Jesus resurrected now is on the other side of the labor of living and dying. And so sometimes you'll hear Christians refer to their Sabbath as the first day, or you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the eighth day, which is we're not just recycling the week, but now something new has come into the world, which is the day of resurrection. And so sometimes you'll go into a church and they'll have a lot of octagons. Like I served at a church that used a lot of octagons, one in Oregon and one in Ohio. The baptismal font was 8-sided, and it was to remind people that when you're baptized, you're going to be brought into this new regime, the eighth day. So there's a reason that Jews keep the Sabbath when they keep it, because they're remembering their heritage. So how you rest and remember makes a difference. And for Christians, how we rest and remember makes a difference. And so what we're remembering isn't just God at the creation, but actually for the Christians, it's God at the recreation. Or we could even just say the new creation. And that's why Christians moved the day of worship to Sunday. Now, one of the concerns that Isaiah has for the people is what he calls trampling the Sabbath. And the reason I want to bring this up, and what we'll see when we get to the miracle story of Jesus too, is that the idea of trampling the Sabbath means we have not been redirected. We might say that trampling the Sabbath means you're misdirected, and it means that you probably are not finding a lot of rest. So, for the Christian, you need to reflect on the question of, is your life misdirected? Is your life restful? And if it's not, then the Sabbath is really a gift for you. And for the Lutherans, that's normally been hearing God's Word, gathering with God's people, and receiving the sacrament. But I think maybe in our time we need to kind of revisit how we rest and redirect, because in our time it's easy to be misdirected, and it's easy not to have any real or significant rest. Now consider what Isaiah describes as the misdirected life. The misdirected life is pursuing your own interests on God's day. And what that means is, rather than taking time to be redirected, you simply direct your attention back to yourself. So what's being critiqued here is a kind of selfishness. So if you call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of God is honorable, then the opposite of that is going your own ways, serving your own interests, pursuing your own affairs, and not taking delight in the Lord. Now that may be a little confusing how I frame that, but just read through these verses, 13 and 14, part of 14, and consider what Isaiah is saying. Trampling on the Sabbath means that we do not direct our energy towards God, but rather we just use it as another occasion to think about ourselves, to refer back to ourselves. And if the Sabbath is about anything, it is about hearing the word. It's not about you. This isn't about you. It's about you, and it's greater because it's you in the light of God. And so we need to have time where we unplug, and in this case, where you turn off your smartphone, you turn off your computer, you turn off the television, you decide not to go shopping, and you just kind of sit and reconnect with what's really important. That's the gift of Sabbath. And there's an old saying about the people of Israel, that Israel did not keep the Sabbath. Rather, the Sabbath kept Israel. And sometimes we get into the long, convoluted conversations about, is this allowable, is that allowable, what does that mean? No, we're not even getting into rules. We're just talking about you need to reconnect. And oftentimes the gift of the Sabbath is you reconnect with people in your family. You reconnect with your God. You rest and you remember. And in fact, that language of remembrance is so significant because for the Christian, that remembrance calls to mind the Eucharist when we say, do this in remembrance of me. Now I'm going to consider just two more things and we'll be done. This helps us understand Luke and that healing story of the woman who's bound by Satan and bent over. So the woman bound by Satan for 18 years. And in fact, in some ways the story has a certain symbolism because there are several times in Israel's history where they are enslaved or taken over for 18 years. And if you think about what I mean, the woman is physically, her body is physically a sign of being misdirected. And yet, even with that, notice she still comes to church. She's still going to the synagogue. So even though her body is misshapen, she is yet going to the place where she can rest and remember. And it's precisely because of that and that faithfulness, that she shows, that Jesus heals her. Jesus wants to unbind on the Sabbath, because if in fact we're resting with God, if in fact we're remembering, then this unbinding, this setting free, is exactly the point of Sabbath. It's not just remembering, oh, wouldn't it be great, which is more imagining. Remembering is, no, this is who we are. And so Jesus is physically healing this woman so she can actually now be who she's been remembering herself to be by attending now the synagogue. And of course, the problem is the people who are there do not see Sabbath as anything more than an extension of normal life. They don't see it as a kind of sanctuary in time, and so they criticize Jesus for healing, and Jesus doesn't have very nice things to say about that. So the healing story in Luke could be for us really kind of an icon. And that icon, if you don't like that word, you could say an image of the gift of resting with God. And it might very well be that for you, the Christian, there are things that you need to rest before God and unbind yourself. And by unbind yourself, I mean let God heal you. And notice, it's not like, oh, well, I went for 5 minutes and sat in his office and decided to leave. This is the long obedience of faith, the perseverance we talked about last week. Continually going and remembering, even in spite of difficult circumstances. And now this life becomes an icon of being rested and redirected and healed by remembrance. And your life can be an icon too. What is it that God would take from you? What burden would God take to remind you, no, stand up straight. You're one of my people. And that's really kind of the image here too. Lift up your head. Your redemption is near. Part of that lift up your head, your redemption is near, fits then with the reading from Hebrews, and this is where I'll end. You'll notice we have a map here of the Old Testament world. And if you read Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, all right, just to remind you guys, we're not talking about going to a mountain, Mount Sinai. We're not talking about touching fire, gloom, darkness, storm, tempest, the loud voice that shook the earth. We're not talking about that. We're talking about you not coming to Sinai, but coming to the heavenly Jerusalem. Not even the earthly Jerusalem, but the heavenly Jerusalem, of which the earthly Jerusalem is supposed to be an image or a sign. And so he wants to make the juxtaposition between what we noticed at the beginning about keeping Sabbath, between the Old Testament and the New. And the idea then is the voice that shook Sinai also comes to shake the world, and not just to shake you to bring you to this place, but to bring you to the place where the angels dwell, to bring you to the place where the blood of the covenant sets you free. And so when you're invited by this voice, Hebrews says, take seriously that you will be shaken. And in fact, that shaking might very well be the loosening of your burdens. And not only the loosening of your burdens, but finally, to bring you to the place where you belong. And so a final word for us might be, heed the voice. Heed the voice. And I don't mean that in a kind of threatening way. I'm just saying the voice of your redemption, the voice that draws near, the voice that spoke to the woman and made her well, is the same voice that calls you to rest. It's the same voice that calls you to remember. And it's the same voice that calls you to be redirected as a gift. Not as a burden like, yeah, I guess I'll remember because that's what God wants me to do. But where you say, oh, thank you for reminding me who I actually am. We'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday.